I'm sorry for the delay, there was a problem. And actually, let's start. So first, who I am. My name is Minasyan. I'm an IT consultant. I work at 11 Labs, which is based in Paris. And I've been working with Symfony 2 for a couple of years now. And I chose to do this topic because I worked on several projects where I had to do the security part. And I realized that a lot of people actually use AC and are not familiar with the role voters and don't really know the advantages that you can have with them. So that's why I decided to propose this talk and to explain this to you. So we're going to do this way. First, we'll see how the Symfony 2 manages security by default, and then we'll talk about the access control engine, the role voters, and then we'll have a small conclusion. So first, the basic security in Symfony. And to do so, to understand how it works, we'll just take this basic security file, security YAML. So there's the encoders, the role hierarchy part, where we actually define that our role administrator will inherit the role user, and then the role super administrator will have the role user, the role administrator, and he'll be allowed to switch users. I think you're familiar with this option. It's actually just for the development, so you can switch easily your users. Then the providers, the firewall, and the access control rules, which allow you to protect some URLs by roles or some other things. Now in Symfony 2.4, you have more options. So have a look at that. So first of all, the security in Symfony, a small reminder, it's done in 2 steps. First of all, the authentication and then the authorization. And today I'm going to talk about the authorization and specifically the role management. And just after me, Joseph will do a conference on the authentication. So if you're interested in security, have a look at that as well. So the main entry point of the security in Symfony 2 is the token, and is the security context, which has a token, which allows us to identify user, which is unique, and it also has the access decision manager, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So, and then it has the authentication manager, etc., and I'm not going to go to the detail there. So the access decision manager, how do you actually call it? Every time you call the service security context in the controller, for example, when you do this get security context, and when you call the method is granted some role for some object, for example, actually you call the access decision manager. Now, what is the access decision manager? It's a class, it's a service that has a list of voters, an array, that has a strategy that you define. Then you also define if you want your user to be able to access a resource if everybody abstains. So that means that none of the voters can actually decide whether they grant or deny access. And there's also the option where you define if you want the user to be able to access a resource if there are the equal amount of grants and denies. So what's a voter? A voter actually is a class that implements a voter interface. It has 3 possible results, actually. The first is access granted. So this means that you will allow your user to access some resource. Access abstain, which means that your voter is not able to define whether the user can access or not. And then the access denied, that means that he can't access a resource. So in this interface is also declared 3 functions. First, the parts attribute, which is actually a role. The parameter is a role, so this means whether your voter will support a role or not. And then there's supports class, which is for the token, actually. Let's say you have multiple user providers. One of them is a web service, for example, and you have a custom token. This means that you could write a role voter for this specific token for this specific user provider. And then finally, the function vote, which will actually define, well, your business logic will be there, actually. So Symfony 2 has actually 3 voters that we use every day, maybe without realizing. First of all, the authenticated voter, which actually supports the 3 roles, is authenticated fully, is authenticated anonymously, and is authentication remembered. So actually, it only supports these 3 roles, and it will define whether the user can access or not. Then there's the role voter, which supports all the roles that start by role underscore something. So when you grant a role user to a user, when you call is a granted role user, you'll actually call the role voter. And then finally, there's the role hierarchy voter, which defines with the actually the array that we've seen in the first slide of the security. It actually planes the array of array in YAML, and it gets a flat array and it calls the role voter, which will define the same as before, whether a user can access a resource. Now let's talk about the strategies. So first of all, there's the affirmative, which means that at least one voter grants access to a resource. Then there's consensus, we'll talk about it in a minute. And then there's unanimous, which actually means that you want all of your users, or all of your voters to grant or deny access. Well, grant actually. So if at least one denies access, your user won't be able to access the resource. Now let's talk about the decide consensus function. This is the function that's defined in the access decision manager, and it actually does this. It will count the number of grants and denies all the voters return. And also that calls all the voters, it counts the number. And then if the number of grants is bigger than the number of denies, it will grant access. If not, if the denies are more, there are more denies, it will deny access. And then it actually uses the two options we've talked about before. So whether they are the same number of grants and denies, it will actually return what you've defined. And well, finally, if there is actually none of the voters have granted access, it will actually, this means that you've called the isGranted method on a role that none of your voters are able to support. So this means that actually there's a problem somewhere. This means you missed something in your application. And the thing to know is that by default, the strategy in Symfony is affirmative. So when one of the voters grants access, the user is able to access the resource. Now, let's talk about customizing your security. Well, here, you know, in your security YAML file, this is where you define your strategy, whether it's consensus, for example, or affirmative. And here I actually decided that if everybody abstains, I don't want my user to be able to access the resource. And if there's a equal number of grants and denies, I want him to actually be able to access the resource. So here's actually a good example, you know, what Symfony does with roles. But what if you want to custom your roles? Maybe you have more of them, and you know there's more things you want to do. So the first thing that comes to mind is the access control engine. I think that's because in Symfony 1 there was one, and maybe that's a habit that people have since then, or maybe because you know it's so complete and there are so many options that people just do this by default. You know, it's the first thing they go to. Now, first of all, the access control engine is not the same thing that the access control lists that are in the security YAML file. It's actually nothing to do with in the security YAML file. There are just rules to protect some URIs. Here we are talking about your role management. So these custom roles can be anything you want, whether it's create, edit, delete, or you can call them really whatever you want. So how does it work? First of all, you create this means that an access control list has one or many access control entries. An access control list is created on object identity. An object identity is actually one specific entity. For example, if we take a blog example, this can be one specific article that an author has posted. Or it can also be a class. This means that, let's say you want your role administrator to be able to edit all of the posts on your blog, so the object identity will be created on the class article. And then the access control entry, which will be added to the ACL, is actually created for a security identity and a mask. Actually, we give two things to this. This means that the security identity is for a specific user or for a role, and the mask is actually the permission you'll give them. So, for example, you create an ACL on your blog post, on the article that is being created, and then you want to add some permission, for example, to the author of the post to be able to modify it later, or to delete it if you change it, if you don't want to post it now. So then there are several access control entry scopes. So the class scope, as I said before, when you define a permission on a specific class, such as a class article, then there's the class field scope. This means, for example, if you have a moderator on your blog, you want him to only be able to modify the statuses of the articles, for example, to publish them or unpublish them. The object scope is the one that is defined on a specific article, and the object field is the really small permission, which will allow you to only modify one field of a specific entry. Now, how does it work in practice? In Symfony 2, actually, you just define, first of all, in your security file, the connection you want the access control manager to use. So, well, here I've taken the default connection because I want my ACL database to be at the same place as my database of the application. But know that it is not necessary at all, actually, because they are not linked, there are no foreign keys, etc. So you can store them wherever you want. And then you actually only need to run the command php app console init ACL. This will actually create 5 tables in your database. And as you can see here, there's the ACL classes, which will store the class scope definitions you've given to your application. Then there's the ACL entries, which will define all the entries you give, so the permission, the security mask, and the ACL is referred to, the object identities, the specific articles, for example, or comments that you've given permissions to, object identity ancestors, we'll talk about it a little later, and the security identities, which are all different roles and users that have permissions. And then there's the schema of my database. So, what are the default permissions that the access control engine gives us? So there are actually bit masks. There are the powers of 2 that are stored in your database. They aren't, there is no text stored in your database. So, and they go from, so powers to 2 from 0 to 7. So view is 0, 1, 2 power 0 is 1, edit is 2, create is 4, and etc. And you should know that you can create some custom roles, but then you cannot go above 2 power 30. So that's the limit. Now, how does it work actually? How does the access control manager, what does he do with these permissions? Well, there's a basic permission map that, well, there's a, where you define your roles, so that, the chain of characters that you try to check the isGranted method call it on. So it creates the constants with that, then you create a map. Well, you actually here you say, so here's my key, which is the permission view, for example, is here, and all the permissions that are in the array associated to this key inherit permission view. So this means that if you're an operator, you can also view an entity. This is like some kind of inheritance. Now let's take a concrete example. There's the blog example with the creation of an article. Well, the first thing you need to do when you've posted your article, well, when your form is valid, etc., first you need to persist your article, because if your article doesn't exist in the database, you won't be able to add a permission on it. So once you've done that, you call the ACL provider, you create the object identity. This is for the specific entity. Like this here, I'm giving permission to the author of the article to be able to actually be the owner and do whatever he wants with this article. So I create the object identity. I create an ACL from this object identity with the method create ACL, and then I create the security identity for the user that is actually connected now to the application. And then I insert object AC. So this means I'm given a object scope permission to the author with a mask owner. So I hope you get that. And then you just persist the entity to your modifications. And here's actually an example where I give a permission to the role administrator on the class user. So I need my administrator in my application to be able to do whatever he has to do to create, edit, or delete users in the application. Actually, I've done this in a command because, well, this is something you do only once. You won't need that anymore. Well, maybe when you deploy your application, the production for the first time. So, the good practice is to do it in a command. So, well, I retrieve the ACL provider. I create the security identity on the role administrator. And then, well, I try to see maybe there is an ACL that exists. If not, I create one. And then I insert a class scope, a access control entry. So with the mask master. There's that. Now let's see how do you access the roles. Well, actually nothing changes from the default Symfony function. You just actually call the method isGranted on your security context. So whether it's in a trigger template, for example, or in your controllers, or maybe you have a manager for your entities, etc. So yeah, you just call isGranted the method on an entity. So here I'm actually checking if the user is granted the role edit on an article to show him the link to be able to modify this article. Now, there's actually inheritance in ACL, which is actually a pretty good option. This means that your one ACL can have a parent ACL. So here in the example, I'm giving all the ACLs that I create on a specific entry. So my blog posts, I make them inherit from the ACL that I've created in my command. So this means that my role administrator users will actually inherit the permissions on all the posts that I created. So this is good. This means that you don't need to create permissions on every blog post that is created for the user administrators. And then you will just send parent ACL, retrieve that, and you set parent ACL. Now let's see how you can custom your permissions, because the role there's edit, view, create, delete, etc. But maybe you want some specific role. For example, you have a moderator, and you want them to be able to publish or unpublish an article. So here you actually just extend the basic permission map that we've seen before of the ACL, and you extend that and you add your own permissions. So here I have publish, unpublish. So I call the parent constructor so that the default map is created with all the permissions that it has, and then I add my permission. For example, for the publish, this means that the mask operator, the mask master, and owner will be able to publish or unpublish an article. So beside that, there's actually the mask builder that exists in Symfony, where you actually define the power of 2 or the value that your permission represents. So that's why you need to extend the mask builder of Symfony and add your permissions just the same as here, actually, the same in the basic permission map. So you say that my mask publish actually is 2.2 power 9. So, well, that's actually quite easy. And the only thing you need to do for your basic map to be used instead of the map of the Symfony ACL default one is actually declare in the parameters YAML file the security.acl.permission.map.class and define your custom class that you've created. Actually, that's a parameter that the Symfony security service calls. So remember, define your classes in parameters, and you just modify it. You just customize it. So instead of using the default one that it is defined in its services.yml, for example, file, it will use this one. So, and then there's actually another option. You don't actually have to, for example, give the permission owner to an article. You can actually just accumulate, permissions. So if you don't want your user to be able to do everything that a specific mask that is defined in the permission map does, you can just, for example, you want him to be view and publish or unpublish his article once you've created it. You can just accumulate that, and this will actually make a sum of the powers of 2 that you've defined, and that's the permission that you insert. So when you create a insert object AC, when you call this method, you pass the security identity, which this AC concerns, and the mask that you've defined. So this is pretty good, right? We've created our ACLs, we've customized them, so your application is working, so this is great. Now you're thinking, wow, that's great, I can do everything with this, I have so much options, there's, it's really awesome. But actually, what happens when you want to modify them or delete them? That's actually the point where it starts to get complicated. Here I'm trying to delete a post article. And first you need to check if the person can access this method. So if not, you will just throw an access denied exception. And then you have to, when you delete a post article, you need to delete all the comments as well. This is logical. You won't keep comments to an article that doesn't exist. And this means actually that you'll need to loop on every comment that your blog post have and delete them one by one. I mean the ACL. So let's say you have an article that has been the hit of the year. It has millions of views and 1,000 comments because everybody loved that. Everybody wants to know more information. There are questions, etc. So this means you'll have to loop on every of the 1,000 of your comments and delete them one by one. This is really a bad solution. This is bad for performances. And then in the end, you have to delete the ACL, the post itself. So what can we do for that? Well, there's a solution. You can actually inherit. You can make your comment entities inherit the permission on the blog post. So this basically means that the parent ACL will be the ACL of the post, which actually also means that the post author will be able to do whatever he wants with the comments. So this is not what you want, because you don't want the article author to be able to modify all the comments that have been posted. So that's why I actually created a mask deny, that when I create my comment, I insert the object ACE mask owner to the user that has posted the comment. Then I set the parent ACL to the post itself. And then I check if the user that is connected right now is not the same, it's not the author of the post itself. And we create a security identity for the post author and insert object ACE with the mask deny. So this also means that our template will change, that not only we'll have to check if the user is granted the role edit on the comment, we'll also have to check if he isn't granted the role deny. So to make sure that that isn't the post author that is trying to modify the comments, modify or delete them. So we'll have to do this 2 times because maybe your users have permission to edit but not to delete, so you need to check it twice. But this way, actually, the good point is that when you remove your blog post entity, you just delete its ACL, and the comment ACLs will be removed as well. So this is good. This is easy. Well, it's great. But this is complicated though. So you had to create a specific map. And what if you have 12 different entities and maybe 400 permissions, and you need to check, really think to every case that is possible. And this is quite heavy management. You can't forget any specific cases, where there maybe someone will actually finally be able to access a resource, be able to delete or modify comment, although he shouldn't be. So there's pretty much risk here. So you don't really know what is the best solution. So now we've seen how the access control engine works. We've seen how you can customize it, add your own permissions, and do whatever you want. But we haven't seen who makes the decision, how does this work? So, who actually decides this? What is behind all this scheme? Well, there's an ACL voter. So this is another default voter in the security component. It has the ACL provider, which actually will go and fetch or store some data in the database. Then the permission map that we can extend. There's some strategies to retrieve the object and the security identities. So, since it implements voter interface, it will have to implement the support attribute function. So this means that he'll actually just go see in the permission map that the role you are asking for is in there. And then it will vote. Well, actually, the vote function is so big, I couldn't fit it in a slide. So there's that. It actually says a lot itself. And, well, that's actually pretty magical. There's a lot of stuff stuff happen in there. And, well, if you're curious, you should have a look because, you know, really everything happens there. So this is actually going to check if your security identities exist, if your object identities exist, if you have permission to call these functions, etc. Then it will actually go see in the database that an access control list exists, and then it will fetch the access control entries if the ACL exists, and then check if one exists on the user you are calling and the permission that you're calling exists. So, you know, there's that. This is quite heavy, right? So what are you thinking now? Tell me, are you interested in using ACE? Do you think that it's a good solution, or do you think that it's quite heavy? Although it's quite permissive, but by show of hands, show me. Do you think it's a good idea to use ACE? So, okay. Well, there's another solution, the role voters. So now let's see how you can do the same with the role voters, you know, what's the solution? Well, actually, it's quite easy. So here I've created my object voter. I'm actually doing the same as I did with the blog example. So, well, I actually decided to pass the roles I want my voter to support. I defined it in a parameter YAML file. So I put edit, delete, publish, and publish. So this is the role I want my voter to support. Then I actually inject it in my service when I declare it. So then that, and when I check the function supports attribute, I just check in array if my role that I'm asking for is in the array that I've defined. Well, there's another thing you need to do. You need to declare it as a service, like I've said. It's actually quite easy. You just say the class that it is, the arguments if you have one. So here I have my custom roles. But you actually don't have to do that. You know, you can also define just like an array in your class. So this is just whatever you prefer, actually. And the only thing that you have to do is to create the tags, is to tag it by security.voter. So this is the important thing. This is actually what tells the security component that it has to check in your voter as well. So if you paid attention, there's actually a second parameter that you can use. You don't have to. The priority. So what is the priority? I mean, what does it mean? Well, actually, your voters have priority. So this means that this defines the order in which they're executed. So actually, the default Symfony voters, the role authenticated voter is a priority 250, I think, and a role voter and role hierarchy voter 245. And the ACL voter is actually 255, so this means this is the first one that will be executed. And actually, how does it work? When in the security bundle, you add the compiler passes, so there's one that is called a security voters pass, which uses an SPL priority queue. It stores all the services that you've declared with the tag security.voter, and it will, you know, just check them by the priority and put the highest one first, and etc. So, you know, this is a good option. So you have several voters in your application. Maybe you want to, so for example, let's take the same example of several user providers. Let's say most of your users come from the service provider that you've declared. So there's means a specific token, maybe specific user class. So, so this means that you have a special role voter for this given token, for the token class. So maybe you want to, since most of your users comes from there, you want the role voter that checks here to be executed before another one that checks on another users. So, you know, this is good, this is good, this is a nice option. And, well, finally, the function vote. What does my voter do? Well, actually, by default, it will abstain, because right now he doesn't know, my voter doesn't know if he can vote or not. So, yeah, well, he'll abstain. And then I check if the object that if one have passed, well, here in my application I need one to be passed, otherwise it doesn't have a meaning actually. So it implements an interface that I've created, so this means that my blog articles and comments will implement this interface. So if it doesn't implement my interface, I can't vote. This means this isn't a comment or a post, so I don't want my voter to be executed. So I will return access abstain. And well, in another case, in the other way, I will check all the attributes that are passed, so this means the roles. I will check if I support them, so if they're, there's role underscore administrator, I don't want my voter to vote. This is the role voter of Symfony that has to do that. So, until I find one, I will just continue doing this. Once I found the role that my voter supports, I will check if the author is the user that is actually connected, or if the user that is actually connected is an administrator. This means that he has a role, which is just an array of roles, so it's quite easy. And well, in that case, I will grant the access. Well, this is actually what we've tried to do with the ACL, which is the same thing. Well, but it's actually with the role voters, it's much easier, right? So we've just spent 16 slides trying just to do basic permissions on a blog and understand how the AC works, how does it all just get together. And then we just did the same in 2 slides with the role voters and in 1 class. So this is good, right? Now the conclusion, let's talk about this. Well, here's actually some comparison I've done. Well, first of all, there's just 1 page with an article and 5 comments. So I actually used the same article, the same content, the same 5 comments. So this is actually, the same content. So yeah, well, with the role voters, it is, faster. Both pages are fast. I'll admit that, but with the ACE, this is actually 70% more, though. This is a big number. It uses a little bit more memory, and it does actually much more database queries. So actually, it does 1 query every time you call is granted my role on my object. So this means that every time you call that, so if you call it here, I call it, 10 times for the comments, because I check if edit is granted or if delete is granted. So since there are 5 comments, it makes 10. And then I have also called it twice on the article itself. So this means 12 queries more. And this is only for 5 comments. So if you have 100 comments, etc., this is getting bigger and bigger, this number. And then I've used xhprof, and here we see this is actually cleared the cache, so this is why numbers for the loading time are bigger. But we actually see the most important thing is that with the ACE, 7,000 functions more are called. So this is big. This means that this is huge. It's a huge number. So 7,000 more functions are called every time you use an access control engine. So now let's compare. Role voters are easy. You just saw that this is quite easy to define. You can write as much as you need them. Although I don't write 300 of them. Try maybe to define your application logic, because I'm sure in the most cases you can. You don't need to create a role voter for each role. For example, if you want the role edit on the article, you don't need to create another voter for just a role delete on an article. You can regroup them by voters. Your roles have to have some application logic. So role voters are faster as well. So all your business logic is in the same place. Maybe it's several role voters, but usually all of your voters will be in the same place, in the same folder of your directory of your application. This means, usually I put them under my bundle security folder, and then my voters for role voters if I have something else. There's that. You have all your business application logic in the same place. This means that you have to change something. For example, you have new roles, or maybe the management decided there's something else. The roles have changed. Other modifications need to be done. It will be easy to change. They're easy to maintain, as well as the ACE. Actually, with the ACE, it's hard. Your business logic is everywhere. So whether it's your controllers, whether your templates, we've seen that is since you change something little in your controller, you will have to change your templates as well. So this is heavy. It's not difficult to maintain because you will always forget some place, and there will always be cases where you have a lot of bundles, a lot of pages in your application. It's for sure you'll forget something. And role voters are easier to test as well. You just need to well, use a data provider, but with AC it's quite hard. So this means you'll need to, you have 5 tables in the database, so you'll have to mug them, so it's hard to test. So, and there's another argument. As Chris said yesterday, he can be wrong, and he uses roll voters as well. So yeah, there's that. So to conclude, well, unless you really don't have a choice, this means that if in your application you have a management of your role which is based on a user-per-user basis, this means that you don't have actually defined precise logic of management in your roles in your application. Well, unless you're in this case, which is really very rare, this has actually never happened to me on a project, well, you should drop access control engine and use roll voters. Well, thank you for your attention. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but maybe if you have one quickly.